Well, good morning. How are you guys today? All right, pretty good. Good job. Well, for the past couple of weeks, Pastor Ben has been going through the Margin series. How many of you guys have been here for the Margin series? Great series. If you weren't here any of those weeks, I recommend you check it out, especially last week. So it kind of was the cherry on top for the whole thing. And so the Margin series was pretty much about us making time or setting some space between our limits, what's our capacity, and our efforts, creating a little bit of extra room, hence the word margin. And then the last week, he finalized it and closed it out by saying, what are we going to fill that time with? What are we going to do with that extra time that we have? And he says, let's fill that time by loving others, by loving those that God has placed in our lives. And, you know, when we hear commandments such as these, we really have to assess, am I being successful at this? Am I able to walk this out? And we really have to ask God to help us. Loving others, loving those who love us is somewhat easy. It's a little bit easier. Loving those who add value to our lives, it can be done. It still takes effort, but it's a little bit easier to do. But my question for you today, what do we do with those who have hurt us? Do Jesus' words apply to them as well? What do we do with our enemies? What do we do with those who have wounded us, created scars in our lives? Are we to love them as well? I believe that today's talk is not foreign to any of us. I mean, this is something that we teach even our little children. You know, we raise them up to be mature and successful and productive adults in society. My wife and I, she's here. We've been married 6 years. And we have a little boy, 2 years old. His name is Honor. And Honor's just the best. But if you know anything about 2-year-olds, number one, they hate to share. They hate to share. And number two, they love to roughhouse. I mean, they play so rough. They just enjoy. I mean, they can't hurt anyone. I mean, they're only 2 little small things. But the combination is bad. I mean, it's just a bad combination. Honor is constantly getting into trouble. So in addition to us teaching Honor, to say thank you, we know all the sign language things, all the videos. We have them all. But in addition to saying thank you and saying please, and teaching them how to share, one of the important things that we are trying to instill in Honor is how to say sorry. This is how you say sorry, by the way. Okay? Sorry. I mean, it's like pulling teeth. Really, literally, it's really hard to Honor hit someone. Honor, come and say sorry. He just stands there and he's all like tense and, he doesn't want to say it. Why do I have to? And, even when someone hits him, when we say, the kid comes to say sorry, we say, Honor, give him a hug. He's like, no, I'm so mad. And he's crying. And, we laugh and it's, it's cute. It's a 2-year-old, but it doesn't get easier. It really doesn't. Many of us, most of us, struggle with forgiveness. Now, we are good at saying sorry. We're good at, some of us are overly apologetic. We say sorry about everything. But, man, is it hard to forgive those who have hurt us, who have injured us? It's really difficult. Some of you in here, it's been years since you talked to a family member, a sibling, because of something that happened way back when. The relationship was torn, it was broken, and you haven't been able to forgive. It's been years since you've talked to them. Some of you don't have great relationships with your parents because of conflict that went on even in your childhood, your teenage years, and just kind of carried forward in adulthood. It gets to the point where you're like, I can't even stand my own parents. I mean, some of us have those types of relationships with our spouses, where there's resentment and bitterness towards our spouse, towards a coworker, towards a childhood bully. The name comes up and we're like, man, I can't stand that kid still. I can't believe I'm still holding on to that because of something they did to us. But I believe that God, through his word, he challenges us to love these people as we saw in Matthew 22, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. That was a passage that Pastor Ben used last week. I believe the word teaches us to forgive them, to let them go. I believe it's there. I believe it's possible. And some of you guys are looking at me like, man, I know what you're getting at. I know what you're going to tell me to do to forgive that person. But Will, you don't know what this person did to me. And you say, they don't deserve forgiveness. You're right. They don't deserve it. I'm not going to argue against that. Some of you know in your mind that you should forgive. You're just like, Will, I don't know how to forgive. How do I go about forgiving this person that has hurt me? I know I've studied God's word, and I feel like conviction. I feel this feeling like I need to let it go. I just don't know how. That's valid. Some of you don't even know if you have forgiven or not. It's like there's a little bit of indifference there. What do I do? What should I be feeling if I know I forgave or didn't forgive? These are all things I hope to go through today. And let me tell you one thing, what I'm not going to do today. I'm not going to tell you that forgiveness is easy, because it's not. Forgiveness is not easy. It is something very complex. I'm not going to give you the 10-step process, because it doesn't exist. It just doesn't. And I'm also not going to argue or present my message from the standpoint that you forgive because it all benefits you. It's all about you. I don't think that's the way Christ modeled forgiveness for us. Christ didn't forgive us for his benefit. We're going to present this message from God's perspective. How does he forgive us? And in turn, challenges us to forgive others. God forgave us for our benefit. For our benefit. So I hope that today we can leave here understanding that God asks us, wants us to forgive. Number two, God helps us to forgive. We're not in it alone. I believe forgiveness is part human, part decision, and part divine. It's that inspiration, that love that flows through us from God. And lastly, I hope we leave here understanding that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, modeled forgiveness perfectly for us through his act on the cross. And we'll be able to forgive. Hopefully, if we press and we strive towards that end goal of being able to let it go, if we put in the effort, it is possible. Because with God, anything is possible. So let us turn today to Matthew 18. That's where we're going to be reading from. If you need a Bible, we have great volunteers that are going to be passing around Bibles. Raise your hand and they'll hand you one. And if you don't have a Bible at home, or you just need another translation, the ESV translation, feel free to keep that. That's a gift from us to you. So Matthew 18, and if you have one of those epic Bibles, it's on page 534. Okay. I'm going to ask you if you could stand with me as we read the Word of God. We're going to read the first 4 verses. Matthew 18, verse 1, it says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus, saying, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, 'Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven.'" You may be seated. Thank you for standing. Today we're going to be mainly focusing on the end of this chapter, which is pretty much Peter's question to Jesus and the parable that Jesus responds with, which is the parable of the unforgiving servant. These two things, the question and the parable, are clearly about forgiveness, undeniably about forgiveness. However, the rest of the chapter, the beginning of the chapter, which is where the conversation begins, it's not as clear that it's about forgiveness. But I want us to draw from the context and be able to see what's really going on here. So Jesus gets a question from the disciples. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus was masterful at being able to take what people gave him that really was missing the mark and give them the essential response. So they're asking, hey, who is the greatest in the kingdom? Jesus comes over here and says, hold on, let me first tell you who enters the kingdom. And who enters the kingdom are the humble. He takes a child and he says, unless you become humble like a child, like this child here, you won't be able to enter the kingdom. You have to be humble like this child. Now, by the way, let me get this aside. How many of you, when was the last time you heard someone describe a child as humble? When was the last time? Oh, that kid is so humble. It just doesn't fit. So Jesus here is not referring to humility or to being humble in the sense that we traditionally understand it. The humility that Jesus is referring to is to the humility of dependence. Children are dependent on adults for their livelihood. Children need adults in order to eat, in order to grow, in order to mature, in order to learn. It is that dependence that Jesus is pointing us to. And in the same way, he's basically telling us we need to depend on God in order to enter the kingdom. We need to rest on him, trust in him, not trust in our own abilities, not trust in what we can do, but to trust in God completely. That dependence, that's the humility, that's what he's referring to when he says we need to be humble like a child. We need to depend on God. So he takes that question, and all of a sudden, as I read this and as I studied it, I saw this switch in Jesus. He begins to talk about sin. And his words change. And I see all this emotion kind of coming out of him. There's word pictures that he's using, drastic language to describe sin. But remember, it's referring to the humble, to those who are in his kingdom, to those who are the greatest, because if you're humble, you're in the kingdom and you're the greatest. So he takes that and switches it and says, but man, look at this. Look what he says. Verse 5, whoever receives one such child in my name, which, remember, child is referring to the dependence. We are included in that child phrase for those of us who have put our trust in Jesus. And it says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. He's just using this drastic language, man, like, you know, I have these children, they are humble, they depend on me, but guess what? And he says it basically in the next verse. Temptation and sin is sure to come. It is inevitable. How many of us are perfect? Anyone? Any takers? None of us. None of us. So guess what? Our sin, when we do things that are not in line with God's character, what ends up happening? We end up hurting people. So he's starting with sin, but he's going to end in forgiveness. The two and two go to hand. Unforgiveness, when we can't forgive, it is a direct result of sin that has taken place. Either we've committed it against someone or they've committed it against us. It is undeniable. Sin is involved. Sin destroys. Sin separates us from God and us from people. There's a tear. There's a brokenness. We don't have to look far to find sin. It's right next to us. With our spouse. In us, it flows from us. With our coworkers. All of our friends, our relationships. Sin is present. What have those wounds done to you? What have those sins done to you? How has those things affected you? Because it leaves an effect. Some of us are able to forgive a little bit easier than others. I completely understand that. And what I'm going to say today, you know, I'm going to radically challenge you to forgive the way Christ forgave us by basically dropping love bombs on people, by loving them, like undeniably, overwhelmingly loving them, praying for them, hoping for them. That's not the case in all situations. I understand that. Some of us are able to just kind of let go of things. that's forgiveness. There's different levels of forgiveness, but I'm referring to what this passage is teaching me, that forgiveness from the heart, that forgiveness that takes what Jesus has done for us, his sacrifice, his mercy, his forgiveness, and says, you know what? What he's done for me is so great. All I can do is live it out and do it for others. That's what I'm referring to today. That's the challenge today. So the passage goes on, the chapter goes on, the conversation keeps moving. He goes from talking about, hey, whoever receives one such child, and he moves on and says, temptation is sure to come, woe to the world. And then he starts talking about the heart of the Father towards those who have sinned. It says the Father doesn't despise them. He doesn't put them to shame. He doesn't reject them. And he gives this parable of the lost sheep. He's like, no, just the opposite. The Father seeks after them. He'll leave the 99 to go seek after the one who has strayed away. So we see God's heart. God is not one who is judging. He is not condemning them. He's actually pursuing and seeking to reconcile and restore that person who has sinned. Following, he gives us some instructions on how we are to deal with people who have sinned against us within the church. He kind of gives us an order. He says, hey, if someone sins against you, you approach them. You try to get them to understand what took place. If they don't listen, you bring some witnesses, so on and so forth. And I love the fact that he says you approach them by yourself. Sometimes that's the last thing we do, is approach the person. We start talking about everyone else about what someone has done to us in church, or who's a brother, who is a sister. And the last thing we do is do what Jesus tells us to do first, is to approach them. A lot of trouble, a lot of heartache could be helped or cast aside if we would just kind of follow Jesus' instructions. So you guys are following me here. We're going to end in forgiveness, but he starts with talking about the kingdom and the children in the kingdom and those who are dependent on him. He starts talking about sin. He starts talking about the Father's heart. He starts giving us instructions on how to deal with that in the church. And then we get Peter's question. I love Peter. In the Bible, one of my favorite people that the Bible shows us. Peter's one of those guys that says what you're thinking, and when he says it, you still can't believe that he said it, even though you thought it yourself. Peter was just so bold and blunt and constantly getting in trouble, constantly being corrected by Jesus, but he just kept at it. It's almost like he enjoyed it. It was just, the relationship he had with Jesus was just like constantly interacting with each other, and Jesus was always putting his foot down and saying, Peter, no, you get it wrong. So let's look at Peter's question. I think it's really interesting how he phrases this. Verse 21, same chapter, he says, then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? All right. So Peter's following Jesus completely. He's not lost. He sees the point. He's talking about sin. He's talking about, I need to forgive. I need to let those things go, that, the Father lets them go. And Peter's like, I don't know about that, though, Jesus. Like, when is enough enough? I can't let people take advantage of me. I can't let people keep hurting me. I can't let people just keep creating scars and wounds in my life. So there has to be a limit, right? Because even the Pharisees and the rabbis of that time had limits. The rabbinic principle, the rabbinic teaching during that time was you forgive your brother 3 times. 3 times. They sin, you forgive. They sin, you forgive. They sin, you forgive. 4th time, all right. You're good. You're in the clear. So Peter's like, I kind of like that. But I know that Jesus is a little more righteous, or a lot more righteous than the Pharisees, because Jesus is always correcting them too. So let me kind of up the ante. All right, they say 3, but how about 7, the number of completion? And after they've completed all their mistakes, then that's it. It's over. Jesus is scratching his Peter, you get it wrong again. Sorry. Here's what he says to Peter. Verse 22. Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. Some versions say 77 times. This is basically saying, we need to perpetually forgive. We need to walk in an attitude of forgiveness. This should be a way of living, not something you decide to do. It is not like you're keeping a log. Okay, they're on number 2. It's not like that. And some of us keep track of what people have done to us. Understandably so. I mean, again, Peter's coming from the standpoint like there has to be a limit. There has to be a limit where people cannot cross, because then it becomes abuse. But Jesus is, he's like, Peter, I understand where you're coming from. And Jesus had to constantly do this in the lives of the apostles and the disciples and those who were following. We all come from a perspective of this world, of our culture, how we grow up. We all have an idea of how things should be done. And Jesus is always kind of realigning them and realigning us and saying, my kingdom is a little bit different. How God does things is a little bit different. And he's correcting their perspective. Not 7 times, but infinitely, 70 times 7. Forgiveness is extremely difficult. It is. But I believe the challenge that I received as I study this, the challenge I want to place on you and give to you is that God kind of wants us to move beyond decisional forgiveness to more of a true forgiveness, which is reflected in love and mercy, which is reflected in the gift that we give to people. I believe he wants us to do that. Let me describe to you decisional forgiveness. Decisional forgiveness is, let's say you are having your birthday party, right? And you invite all your friends, and the person you expect to be there, your best friend, doesn't show up. I mean, guys are like, oh, who cares, whatever. Probably for the one. I just realized that. I was like, I wouldn't care that much, but anyway, I wouldn't throw a party for myself anyway, but for the ladies, this might be a little bit more applicable. I don't know. But, I'm sorry. All right, we'll move on from that illustration. But to kind of illustrate the point, they call you later on in the week and they say, hey, I'm sorry, and you're hurt, and you're like, you don't necessarily feel like, hey, I can't hold it against them. They got busy or whatever it was. So, in your mind, you decide to forgive. Okay, I'm going to forgive you. You're basically saying, hey, I'm not going to take revenge on you for missing my party, even though I may want to. I'm going to let it go. I'm not going to avoid you, because, hey, you're still my friend and I still love you. You're basically saying, I'm going to put all these negative feelings aside. I'm going to put all these retribution, these actions that I can take, I'm going to put them aside and I'm going to let it go. I'm going to love you no matter what. That's decisional forgiveness. And guess what? The reason it's decisional forgiveness is because we do it with our minds, but yet our hearts kind of trail behind. We say, hey, I forgive you. I get it. Okay, cool. But yet inside we're still a little bit hurt. But what if, same situation, what if instead of letting that hurt kind of just dwindle, like, over time I'll get over it? What if we found a way to love them in spite of it? You know what I'm trying to say? What if we found a way to take those negative emotions, negative feelings, and replace them with positive things? Do something special for them. Hey, like, you couldn't make it to my party, but it's kind of like you're throwing it in their face, but hey, let's do something. I want to take you out, or whatever it might be, Imagine if doing something like that. And that's like, man, that's weird. Like, why would you do that? Like, why would you go above and beyond when they kind of gave you their leftovers? They settled for less. I mean, I think that's what Christ did for us. We've been giving God our minimal, but God gave his all when he presented his son, Jesus Christ, to us. It's like, wow. God gave his all. God gave the best of him. He didn't give us leftovers. He gave the best of him. And that's the type of forgiveness, man, that it doesn't make sense in our minds. But when we look at Christ And when we're about to read this parable, we see, wow, you've done all this for me. I can do it for others. Even though they may owe me something, I'm not going to hold that against them. I'm going to give them something in return. I'm going to forgive them. I'm going to love them. Some of you guys are still like, eh. All right. Let's get into this parable. It's a really cool parable. Really powerful. Verse 23. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Now, 1 talent, commentators are all over the place with this, but 1 talent is estimated to be about 20 years' wages. How many lifetimes of wages does this guy owe the king? 10,000 talents. I mean, I can't even do the math. It's crazy. Verse 25, and since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Now, this is about a couple of months of wages. So we're talking about lifetimes of wages that is owed to the king compared to what his peer owes him, a couple of months. Let's see what happens. He owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him. He uses the same words that this very same guy used with the king. Have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. Amazing. The point that I get from this parable is that forgiveness is a non-reciprocal gift that we give to someone who doesn't deserve it. Forgiveness is a gift that we give to someone who doesn't deserve it. That's the point that I get from this parable. Do those who have hurt us deserve forgiveness? No. They deserve punishment. They deserve justice. Now, I'm not saying that we should shut down the court system because we shouldn't punish everyone or anyone. I'm not saying that. Trust me, the court system is there for a reason. Justice in the court system should be, acted out, should be pursued. If someone abuses a little child, yes, that person needs to be behind bars and locked away. So I'm not saying that the court system needs to be dissolved. What I am saying is that, are we supposed to hold on to what these people have done to us, where we have them like this servant, where we're seizing them and we're choking them, and are we supposed to come with revenge and vengeance against these people? The scripture tells us not to. We're supposed to let them go. We're supposed to forgive them. They deserve justice. They deserve punishment. That's what's fair. That's what's deserving. But what's undeserving and what Christ is challenging us to give them is mercy, is a gift. It's the same mercy and gift that he gave us. So what you deserve and what you get are two different things with God. And it should be the same thing when we're dealing with other people. What they deserve is one thing, but what we are being challenged to do is give them something different. It's to give them forgiveness, to give them love, to let them go, to release them, and to hope for the best for them. That's the challenge here. Jesus demonstrated that on the cross. He gave us mercy when he could have given us judgment, punishment. But when we turn to God, he accepts us, he embraces us, and that action, that work that was completed on the cross, we receive it completely. There are two things that bind us to people. There are two things that bind us to people. And this is really important that we understand this. Number one, a promise binds us to another individual. We make a promise when we walk down the aisle and we stand before the pastor or the preacher, and we come into a covenant with our spouse. Marriage is a sign of an example of a promise that is made between two individuals. We make a promise when we sign a contract, whether we're saying we're going to pay this person or this organization, for a car loan or a phone, whatever it might be. That's a promise. We make verbal promises. Yeah, I'll be there. That's a promise. Those things are not easy to break at all. We are bound to that person. And though we may try to take them lightly and say, hey, yeah, I'm married, but I'm getting a divorce. It's not as easy as just saying, yeah, I'm going to get a divorce. There's a tear. Those things, you were bound to that person. You were joined together, and there's a tear. They're taking a little bit of you, and you're taking a little bit of them in the whole process. It's not easy. Same thing with contracts. Try to break your phone contract. They're going to hit you. They're going to get you. Even with verbal contracts, there's nothing in writing, they're before God, but it's something simple. Yeah, I'll be there at 10 o'clock. You get there at 11. You hurt someone because you gave them your word. You made a promise. And now that promise was broken. So that's one way we are bound to people. The second way is unforgiveness. We are bound to people when we don't forgive them. We carry that person around like a dead weight. I mean, we take that person, that situation, that incident, whatever happened to us, we take them with us everywhere. Everywhere we go, we are carrying that person around, and it affects our outflow, how we are living our lives. It affects our interactions with people. We are bound to those individuals. And unless we do something about it, we will keep carrying that person around with us. We will. Here's how you know if you haven't forgiven. Some of you have been in situations where you go to a family gathering and you're there, you're living it up, you're having fun, you're talking to your family, your mom, your dad, whoever it might be, playing with your niece and nephew, and all of a sudden someone walks in who knows the family or is part of the family, and all of a sudden your stomach gets into knots. You guys know what I'm talking about. Your heart drops. I mean, your whole demeanor changes. There's more than likely there's a little bit of unforgiveness there. You haven't been able to heal from that wound. You haven't been able to move beyond it. Someone might say a name, like I mentioned earlier. And all of these feelings just come up like, man, I hate that person. I can't stand them. This flood of emotion comes up. It's more than likely there's a little struggle there with unforgiveness. It's possible. You don't have to dig deep, though. As I'm speaking, these situations, these people are coming to mind. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we forgive? I think a key to all of this is having empathy. Empathy is really key for us to possess and work through in order to be able to forgive someone. I want to share with you a quote from Dr. King. It's a really good quote, and I think it will speak volume to us. It says, we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. If I could excuse anyone, if any of us could excuse anyone and feel like, hey, that person has a right to harbor a little bit of unforgiveness, Dr. King would be a candidate for that easily. I mean, just the abuse, the hatred, the attacks that this man and the movement, as he led the civil rights movement, suffered were incredible. If we can let anyone slide, hey, Dr. King, you could slide, but he's like, no. He represented true forgiveness to me. He worked towards nonviolent resistance. He worked towards reconciling the two sides. He made it a point never to harbor any resentment, anger, hatred towards anyone. He lived this out to the fullest. As he said in the quote, he sought a way to identify with people. He sought a way to put himself in their shoes. Hey, there's a little bit of evil in the best of us, and there's a little bit of good in the worst of us. That's what empathy is. Being able to identify with someone. That's kind of like the superficial level and the first level, and then you get into deeper where you begin to start to feel for them. You almost start to feel bad for them. Like, man, if this person is able to do this, like, what have they gone through? And you start to empathize with them. And then you begin to start to feel compassion towards them. And that's where that love floods in. Empathy is key to us being able to forgive those who have hurt us. I don't know your situation. I'm almost afraid. And as I think about, man, all the different stories in here, it really burdens me. It really hurts me because I know some of you have been through the worst of moments, worst of times, worst of situations. But as we look at Christ and what he did for us, some of you may not understand this, but compared to what Christ has forgiven us from, what people have done to us have nowhere near the value. Relatively speaking, what Christ has done for us and what others have done to us, they're too far apart, just like these two servants. And he's like, I've forgiven you so much. Go out and do the same. Go out and do the same. It's not going to be easy. It's super complex. I want to share this last quote with you, and this is a book I recommend. It's by Everett Worthington, and if this is a real struggle, I recommend that you get it. He's a researcher. He was researching forgiveness since the 80s, and in 1995, a burglar came into his mother's home, and she caught him by surprise, and they murdered her. So here, 10 years into his studies, he's actually having to live it out, and he shares that story in his book. So if this is a struggle, I recommend this book, definitely. Here's what he says: forgiveness is as mysterious as love. I have forgiven some horrendous offenses in hours and nursed petty grudges for years. Does that sound like some of us? Like, we've been able to forgive this person for that, but yeah, we hold on to this. We are going to leave here, and we're going to hopefully take this message to heart. What the next couple of steps look like, I'm not completely sure for you. I'm not sure what call you need to make to which person. I can't tell you that. I don't know what note you need to write. I don't know who you need to get down on your knees and pray for. Some of you need to get with a friend and basically commit to them, hey, I really want to forgive this person for what happened in my life. I need your help. Will you walk with me through this? I think people are willing to do that. I hope people are willing to do that for you in this room. It's to walk with you through the process. It's not easy, but God helps us through the situation. What would it look like if this church, if each and every single one of us would go out and just start dropping these love bombs, like just praying for people, loving people, in spite of what they've done for us, done to us, in spite of it, what would it look like? I believe people would be surprised by it, caught off guard. Some of them may even ask, what happened to you? That's an opportunity for you to share the love of Christ and what he's done for you and what he wants to do with all of us. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is something that I believe God is asking us to do. I don't think God will ask us to do anything that we couldn't do. I don't think he would set us up for failure. This is something we all can do through him, with his help. The Bible teaches that love conquers all, you know. The Bible teaches that with Christ, through Christ, anything and everything is possible. I want to encourage you today and just go out, make that call, write that note, get on your knees to pray, and ask God to help you with this. Let people go. Get that weight off your back and forgive people. Some of you have never experienced even the forgiveness of Christ. It's something that I've been talking about throughout this message, but this parable exemplifies the great love that God has for us, each and every single one of us. He draws us to him. He calls us forth. He wants us to enter into a relationship with him. He says, I'm not going to hold this against you. And that's what he has for you today. Through Jesus, he offers forgiveness. I'm going to pray for us. I'm going to pray that God will help us through this again, that we will have the strength to be able to go out and do it, that we will just love people and forgive them despite anything that's been done to us.